Evet. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Selamünaleyküm. Dear guests, first of all, I would like to welcome you all to the library of our institute. I would like to express our happiness to see you here. Today is the 6th of Institute talks this semester. Today's talk will be in English. This is the first English talk since the re-establishment in 2022. In this respect, it has a certain importance for us, for our institute. However, I should also note that conferences, lectures were in various languages were held in our institute before. Among those, Muhammad Hamidullah's lectures in Arabic and French should be reminded. Yakoob Ahmed, who has recently appointed as a lecturer to our institute, will make today's talk. Ahmed received his master's and doctorate degrees in the SOAS in the United Kingdom. Later, he worked as a lecturer at Istanbul University Faculty of Theology for almost 5 years. Since the beginning of this year, it is our pleasure to have him as an assistant professor. I believe many successful events await for us. Now I give the floor to Yakoob Ahmed to give his speech. Please.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that wonderful introduction. Yes, so many of you probably have now known and had the news that I am now a affiliated member of this institution, and I'm exceptionally grateful to be given the opportunity. It's strange when I first came to the Ilahiyat, people used to joke that I will be the next Hamidullah. It's always interesting to hear the name Hamidullah in presence when I'm here. In that sense, there is a tradition in Turkey of having scholars from around the world who have contributed to the discourse in Turkey in regards to Islamic studies. I pray to Allah Ta'ala that I can be one of those people and I can leave a small imprint behind in terms of my time in Turkey. If I can achieve even an ounce of what Hamidullah achieved, that would be phenomenal in of itself, but I'm not optimistic in that sense. But so let me start my talk. I'm really sorry today. You can see I'm not as upbeat as I usually am. The Turkish influenza got me. The city has been savaging everybody, and it got me as well. The last 7 to 10 days, I've been up, down. Alhamdulillah, right now I'm okay. So I'm going to give this a go. Okay. So the nature of my talk, as many of you know from the title, was the idea or the impact or the influence of Ottoman lawmaking or Ottoman law practices on Asiatic societies. The reason why this idea came about actually was when I was in the Malaysian southern state of Johor Bahru. Well, no, actually at the time I was in Kuala Lumpur, and I was given a presentation on the impact of the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Constitution on Johor Bahru. And at the time, the Queen of Johor contacted me and said she wanted to attend my talk, and things became very wild and crazy very quickly. That is not something I'm accustomed to. Before I knew it, there was a protocol where I had to wear a suit. Everybody in attendance had to wear a suit. There had to be a red carpet, and I didn't know what was going on. But as a consequence of that, I was then invited to meet the Queen in her palace and meet the Grand Mufti of Johor. And what was bizarre is I was given a private tour around the state, and I started to notice things that looked familiar. Buildings looked familiar, educational structures looked familiar. And as I had anticipated and speculated, there was an Ottoman influence in the southern state of Johor Bahru. fast forward a few years after that, I had the opportunity to go to Japan. And when I was in Japan, a group of Japanese scholars were translating the Majelle into Japanese. They invited me to see this, and I was intrigued to see this delegation. What I noticed was there were lawyers, Islamic studies students, Arabic studies experts, and they were all sitting in a room together, translating the Majelle into Japanese. Sorry. And I just found it fascinating. I said, what's going on here? And the conversations were fascinating to me. They said, this doesn't translate like this translates to that in Japanese. We don't have this in Japan because this is very Islamic. And what was intriguing is the constant reference to saying, this is not Western, this is not Japanese, but this is Islamic. And that was something that intrigued me both in the case of Johor and in the case of Japan, which is that how is it possible that something like the Majelle and something like the Ottoman Constitution is exported to other parts of the world? And how do they embrace that? So the narrative is continually a narrative of Western influence on the Ottoman Empire. But I'm not that interested in that. I've got bored of that narrative. What was more interesting for me was how can I recenter the Ottoman Empire to look at itself, and then how were the other states looking at the Ottoman Empire? So if you look at the case of the Majelle, for example, the Majelle was still being implemented. It's still being used in the state of Johor Bahru today, by the way. So the Majelle is still there, which is intriguing for me. And I'll talk about that later. What I found interesting regarding the Majelle was that it was being used in Iraq until the 1950s. In the 1940s, it was used in Syria. But even the Israeli state only abolished using the Majelle in 1984. Now, why did that happen? Why were they using the Majelle? How does that operate? Now, one of the arguments could be is that the Majelle is a secular law code. It can be easily applied and used across the board in any sort of religion, tradition, and civilization. That's one argument. It's a very simplistic argument. Another argument could be that the Majelle is indeed Islamic, but it's a civil code, and it's not a religious code. In that sense, it should be under the values of Islam, the universal values of Islam. It can be, and it's possible. It could be applicable to other peoples, other civilizations, and so on. Another thought process is just like we make the argument that Western norms and codes could be implemented or were being implemented in the Ottoman Empire. Is it possible that Islamic norms and codes could be implemented into other civilizational thoughts and practices? So these are all the ideas that came to my mind in terms of what is happening here, right? In that sense. And one of the things that I noticed, and I said Asiatic empires, is because in the 19th century and early 20th century, there was an immense interest by Asiatic states in terms of what Istanbul was doing. A host of delegations came from China, Japan, Siam, Malaysia to Istanbul to see their legal transformation, to understand it. In the case of China, it was very interesting because the Chinese would make the argument that the Ottomans were not Europeans, but they were Asians like us. The Japanese, on the other hand, believed that the Ottomans were Asian and European. And the Japanese also made the argument, or some of the delegations of the Japanese, that Islam is a Western religion, which is intriguing. How do they see Islam as a Western religion? The argument is that they saw Islam as being progressive, right? It's not that alien in that sense, which is an interesting thing that they posit there in that sense. When the Malaysians take on the Majelle, they saw the Majelle process, and they say this categorically, as a process of Islamization, not Westernization. In the same case of Afghanistan, when the Afghans look at the Majelle as a process, they also see it as an Islamization process, not a Westernization process. So on the one hand, you're seeing Muslim states, Muslim governments, and Muslim thinkers in other parts of the Muslim world making the case that the Majelle is a form of Islamization. Yet in Ottoman history, the dominant discourse is that the Majelle is a form of Westernization, which I find intriguing. in that sense. And so this is something that came to my mind. And so this is why I became interested in this sense. Okay, so the first thing that I want to highlight to you then is there are some clear conceptual challenges that I have here. And the English medium doesn't help. So there's three forms of law. The word law in itself needs some form of examination when we're looking at what the Ottomans are doing in the 19th century, right? The word Sharia does not simply translate as law. We know that. So now we have a bit of an issue here. Because the word imperial law, Islamic law, and customary law are assumed, and we assume that we know what these mean. And I continuously hear these words being used within the corridors of Western academia. And whenever I ask the question, but what does that mean? There's a sense of confusion. Well, what is imperial law? And I remember going to a conference quite recently where an Ottoman academic said, that's not Islamic law, that's imperial law. And my head was a little bit confused. I said, what do you mean? It's imperial law, not Islamic law. What is the point you're trying to make? Clearly, the point that's being made here is that there is a particular form of imperial lawmaking by the Sultan, which is secular. And then there's the Islamic part. That doesn't help, because imperial lawmaking can also be Islamic. If not, one could argue it is Islamic. It's part of that sort of like debate. So then you ask the question of what is Islamic law? Is it the Sharia? Is it fiqh? Is it Qanun? Is Islamic law religious law? How do we make sense of this term, this concept when we say Islamic law? I remember somebody asked me a question in a podcast that I did. He asked me, are the Ottomans Islamic? I didn't know what he was asking me. I said, what do you mean? Are they Islamic? What are you asking me? And the shock on the person's face, because nobody had ever said, I don't understand. I said, are you asking if they are religious? Are you asking if they were implementing Islam? Are you asking if it was a caliphate? Like, what are you asking? Yes, were the Ottomans a caliphate? So then to that I responded, was Salah ad-Din Ayyubi Islamic? He's not a caliph. No, that's not what we mean. What we mean is, are they implementing the Sharia? Were they implementing the Sharia? So, but we can ask that question in many nation states today. No, that's not what I mean. Were they good people? What are you asking me exactly? What he didn't realize, or what wasn't realized at the time, is that nobody had ever questioned that question, right? So here, once again, you can see that there is a real conceptual problem, actually, that when the word Islamic law is being used, it's a 19th century construction, okay, in that sense. The other concept is customary law. What is customary law in that sense? Is custom and customary law the same? Can customs become law? And are customary laws forms of, is it positive law? Another thing is, can customary law be transformative? And when and how does something become customary? Okay. And the quick reason why I'm asking you this question is, when does something become a custom? When does it become to a point where you say, we've always been doing that? There is always a moment where it's first introduced, right? In that sense. And the reason why I say that is because in 1876, 77, when the Magellan was introduced, that was new. But in 1911, if you see the parliamentary papers, Mustafa Sabri Effendi makes a request in the Ottoman parliament to extend the Magellan, including the criminal law code, by making the case that this is our custom. By now, it's become established. And this is what's intriguing. And the reason why I'm making this case about Mustafa Sabri's introduction in 1911 to the parliament is there is an assumption amongst some Ottoman historians that the Magellan was a temporary measure. I'm not convinced it was. Because if in 1911 there was an argument being made to extend it, then that's not temporary anymore. If the Magellan has been exported to Afghanistan and Malaysia, that also suggests that it's not temporary, that it's global. Something else is happening. So what the point is, I guess, is the point I'm asking is, we have to re-examine how we look at legal codification and whether legal codification fits within our understanding within the Islamic remit of how things work, right? And the way that I look at it is that the way that I want you to understand, and this is, I'm still at the speculative stage, okay? So I'm more than happy at being totally wrong at this thesis. It doesn't matter to me. So if somebody today said to me, Agha Hoja, you're talking nonsense, I said, no problem, because I'm still speculating this. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to be a little bit brave and a little bit risky, and I've thrown it out to you to see whether you see any merit to this argument. But my argument is this, okay, generally, is that Islam is still the canopy. It's still the giant umbrella that everything is under. So even if there's a transformation taking place in regards to the modern period, where we're creating forms of codification, where the agency might be taken out of the hands of the individual and being placed in a new form of lawmaking, nonetheless, the canopy, the umbrella, is still Islam. And that is very important to understand that the Majalla does not contradict Islam. The constitution does not contradict Islam in that sense from what I've understood, because the general canopy, the general framework, the overarching framework, at least in the Ottoman Empire, is very clear, is that Islam is the framework from which everything works under. And I want you to understand it like that. So one of the points that I was making is that this, maybe we could argue, is a process of incorporation. The incorporation does not lean towards hybridity, okay? But instead an ability to integrate a diversity of sources into one single framework. The argument I'm making here is Islam capable to embracing different forms of lawmaking into its language? Not only that, but not only in regards to the diversity of laws outside the spectrum of traditional Islamic practice, but what about the diversity within Islamic traditional practice? One of the interesting points that I noticed in the Majalla itself, which I find fascinating, is that it's a conglomeration of different forms of Hanafi thinking. That's what's interesting about it, that it's actually gone the breadth of the Hanafi school into all the different spaces. And what we learn then from the Majalla is the Hanafi school is huge. And then it's been able to take aspects from the different various forms of the Hanafi school and place them within the context of one document. I don't think a single scholar is able to do that. That is an exceptional process. It requires a team of scholars to be able to achieve that. And I think that's what the Majalla tells us. The Majalla tells us is this is a huge operation under the state to try to create a civil law code for dummies so that it can be used across the Ottoman Empire in that sense. All right, so the next point I wanted to make then is let's look at the Ottoman legal transformation. And at the moment, I'm sorry I'm boring you with just the Ottoman stuff. I'll get to the foreign stuff later. Which is the first thing is the influence of Ibn Abidin. Okay, the reason why I mentioned Ibn Abidin is because a lot of the ideas, conceptual ideas in the Majalla already exist in the works of Ibn Abidin, and yes, Ibn Najim as well. But the reason why I mentioned Ibn Abidin in particular is because he's a non-state alim. Okay, Alim Jebdid Pasha is a state alim. So here what you have is a non-state alim and a state alim. And when you look at the ideas that are being said in the Majalla and the works of Ibn Abidin, there seems to be a correlation here. And why this is important is because it gives you an indication that the non-state ulama had a particular capacity to find ways of influencing the state. You didn't necessarily only have to be a state alim to be able to have a role in the influencing of state matters. And Ibn Abidin's ideas are both quite interesting because they seem to find their way into the Majalla process. Another interesting thing about Ibn Abidin is that his son was on the drafting committee of the Majalla. Okay, so clearly Alim Jebdid Pasha is interested in that, right? So I want you to understand that when the Ottoman legal transformation is happening, don't purely see it from a state perspective, there are huge mechanisms within the Ottoman Empire that have ulama who are non-state actors, who have ways and methods and mechanisms of influencing the state. That's why the ulama are interesting. That's what makes the Ottoman Empire interesting, is that the ulama don't necessarily have to be state actors. We have state ulama and non-state ulama that are part of a larger network of what I call a meta-institution of influencing Ottoman legal thought. Okay, so the next thing is, as I said, is the constitution. And one of the reasons why probably the Magellan and the constitution come into fruition is the bureaucratization of the Ottoman Empire. So, and the introduction of printing press. Okay, the printed press changes everything in the paper revolution. To some degree now, we can document, and forms of documentation become far more authentic in the eyes of people than the oral tradition. And so there becomes a dependency on documentation over the spoken word. And that's what's happening in the Ottoman Empire at this time. You can see that there is an intensification of being able to document at a time when that hadn't happened before in Islamic history. Now, some people will say that that form of modernization is problematic. The problem here is, do you want a pre-modern Ottoman Empire to survive in modernity? It's just not possible. The transformation has to take place. The question is how, right? And another point I'm trying to make here is the trans-regional, trans-national, and cultural aspect of it. The Ottoman Empire, unlike Western Europe, is trans-regional, trans-cultural, cultural, and to many points, there are multiple religions in the empire itself. Okay, there's not even a single denomination of Islam. So if you go to Iraq, Iraq has a large component of Iraqi Shia Muslims and Iranian Shia Muslims who are living in Iraq under Ottoman authority. So the point I'm making is you can start to see that what's interesting about the Ottoman Empire when it's making law, that it has to construct law and take into consideration not only different cultural norms within the Ottoman Empire and different religious norms, but even Islam itself has to be tailored to the different ways in which people are understanding Islam, whether it's from the perspective of madhabs, culture, urf, and Sunni Shiism, and so on, right? Europe doesn't have that issue. Okay, it doesn't have to worry about that. And the reason why I'm making this point is to highlight to you then that the Ottoman case is a complicated one. And it's one of diversity. And if it has the capacity to incorporate the complexities that exist in its own empire, why can it not have the capacity to deal with the complexities of something foreign? Okay, why can it not do that? And that's something that we have to take into consideration. It's an empire, okay, in that sense. All right, so as I said, I want to decenter Europe and recenter the Ottoman Empire and the Asian states. All right, so let's move on and now go to the Asian states. One of the points I wanted to make in terms of this paper, what I'm working on, is the idea of moving scholars. One of the idea is when the scholar is moving, the law is moving, because the scholar is the embodiment of that law. Okay, so when legal scholars are moving from one country to another or one area to another, they're taking the law with them, they're taking the interpretation of the law with them, and then they're applying it wherever they are. And that's how law is moving. So it's not just moving in documentation, it's moving in the embodiment of the scholar themselves. And that's important. The reason why I'm explaining that to you is because all the delegations from Asia, from the various nations that came to Istanbul had legal experts, all of them. Okay, every single one had legal experts who were looking at the Ottoman Empire to see what the Ottomans were doing in an attempt to understand in that sense. So you can see that this movement of scholarship is taking place. The problem is, in legal history in particular, is the emphasis on text over the person. We put far more emphasis on the text of the law itself, because a lot of legal history is done by legal experts, but it's not done, not a lot of it, but some of it. But the problem is that very few of these legal experts will look at the memoirs of those legal practitioners. those legal scholars, they won't look at their thoughts, their ideas, their opinions. How did they come to this point? What were they thinking? What was their thought process? That is missing by and large to some degree. So you get a very abstract understanding of the law. You don't get a human understanding of law. And my argument is, my argument is that the Ottoman state is an emotional state. What do I mean by that? Which is that the law isn't abstract. The law has an emotional component because it has a human component. Okay, unlike the modern nation state where the law can be quite distant from the regular person, so the sense of injustice can feel greater because there's no real human connection component here. But in religious societies, thank you, with religion being emotional in of itself, when the law comes from religion, in this case Islam, and when the practitioners of the law are religious people, the ulama, then naturally there is a component in the law where there's a moral and ethical component that's expected from the law itself, right? In that sense. The reason why I'm making this point is because there is a consistent argument of the introduction of positivism in the 19th century to the detriment of this emotional component that Islamic law was practicing prior to that. And I'm not convinced that that's happening, okay, in that sense. All right, so my next point, let me do this. All right, so as we know in the Ottoman case, the Ottomans had a constitution in 1876 and the Majella in 76. The constitution is suspended, and then in 1908 we have a revolution and the constitution comes back, right? In Japan, they call it the ordinances, okay? So when the Meiji, so-called Meiji restoration happens in 1868, one could argue that that is the first revolution of the Asiatic empire, okay, to some degree. That's open to debate in Japan, but they have a document in which they talk about what it means to be part of the Meiji period. The Japanese sent a delegation to Istanbul in the 1870s, then in 1877, and then in 1881, 82. I need to just double check my dates because I need to check my PowerPoint. But the Japanese sent 3 delegations to Istanbul and Cairo. On the first delegation in the 1870s, one of the things that they're looking at is the mixed courts in Cairo and the commercial courts in Istanbul. Unfortunately, the Sultan wouldn't let them look at the commercial courts in Istanbul. They asked and they requested, but he kept saying no. But when they looked at the mixed courts in Egypt, they were not satisfied with what was happening in Egypt regarding the mixed courts, and so they rejected that. The second time, they spend a month in Iran, or maybe longer, and then after going to Iran, they come to Baghdad and Istanbul, and they meet Sultan Abdul II, and they also meet the Grand Vizier, and although the Ottoman constitution is suspended, what's interesting is they talk about the constitution to constitutionalists in Istanbul. Okay, so in that sense, the Japanese still want to know what's intriguing is you read some of the Japanese works, they said, we knew the Sultan was going to abandon the constitution. The question for them is, why did he abandon it? They want to know, so they still want to know the idea. And what's fascinating is after the visit to Istanbul, 1 or 2 years later, the Japanese have a constitution, okay, which is intriguing. The state of Johor Bahru in 1895 has a constitution, and the Johorian Sultan comes to Istanbul in 1890, and they embrace the Ottoman Hanafi Majella in full Arabic. For those of you who know that the state of Johor Bahru is actually Shafi'i. And it's only more recently in the modern Malaysian nation state have they turned all those Hanafi codes into Shafi'i codes. So that in itself is an interesting project that needs to be looked at. But they still kept the Majella. And the trip by Sultan Abu Bakr was to Istanbul and Cairo. And then after that, he spent 4 to 6 weeks in Japan. Now, what's intriguing about his trip to Istanbul is that he married, Abdul Hamid gave him a concubine. He married a concubine from here. But when he goes to Japan, there is also a story that he married a Japanese woman. And there's these narratives of this Japanese woman being on the ship of this Malaysian Sultan. Now, what's intriguing here, the point I'm making about Malaysia, it seems to be a gateway point where there's traveling taking place to the Ottoman Empire and traveling taking place to Japan, and the Malaysians clearly consider themselves as Muslim, but at the same time consider themselves as Asian, and they're trying to see some sort of commonality that can be made where they can observe the Japanese and observe the Ottomans to some degree. Why am I mentioning this? Because in Malaysian historiography, the dominant discourse is the Malaysians were inspired by the British. This Japanese and Ottoman context is missing. There are some scholars now who have written papers on the Ottoman influence, but they haven't looked at Malaysia's influence on these various states, okay, in that sense. In the case of Afghanistan, in 1877, Polisi Effendi, who was part of the drafting committee of the Majalle, was sent to Kabul by Abdul Hamid II. And when we went to Kabul, the popular argument is that he went to Kabul to speak to the Afghans as a way of convincing them that Istanbul and the Afghans can become a bloc against the Russian encroachment. That's the popular narrative. But why Hulusi Effendi? Why an alim who was part of the Majalle drafting committee? Well, Faiz Ahmed is convinced that, and he writes it in his book, which I found compelling actually, that he also went there to talk to them about Islamic lawmaking and modernizing Islamic law. That the Afghans are asking them in Istanbul, how are you modernizing? Explain the Majalle to us. What were you doing? Explain the constitution. Okay, and we know this because the Aman Ali codes are basically taken from the Majalle. Okay, so this is an example of a movement going on, okay, from Istanbul to Afghanistan. In the case of Johor Bahru, the Sultan and his advisors, who were ulama and constitutionalists, came to Istanbul and Cairo. Okay, these are once again legal practitioners. So they didn't just go to Abdul Hamid and said, "Can you give us a book? Here's the Majalle. Go take it to, Johor and do what you want." They came to show it to us. What is this? What are you doing? Explain it to us, because they understand that they need to modernize legally as a way of surviving. Okay. What we're seeing then is the Majalle and the Ottoman constitution are not mechanisms to become Western. They're mechanisms to survive and to stop Western encroachment. They're indigenous attempts to restrict that. And that's interesting for me, because what are they attempting to do? What it seems like is that the Asiatic states are trying to maintain their cultural integrity in the changing global world order, where they can find similarities amongst themselves and maintain some sort of Asian identity so that it doesn't get taken over by the Western Europeans in the legal structures. In the legal structures, right? What we see in this moment then is we don't have one type of international law. We have multiple forms of international laws. There are negotiations taking place. The homogeneity of international law under the guise of Western hegemony takes place after World War II, when there's complete capitulation on many states, on many levels. Collapse of the Ottomans, collapse of the Meiji, collapse of the Qing, and so on. When that happens consistently, then there is a possibility of creating. So prior to that, these imperial powers are resistant. Okay? No, it's amazing. Like, when I talk Ottoman history, I'm quite boring. I've just realized. I was like, I'm listening to myself. Yeah. Anyway, so let's look at the Meiji period. All right. In one of the interesting things in the 1868 Charter, the Meiji Oath, it says, evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based upon the just laws of nature. That's how it's translated in English by the British. And that is a common translation, and that is a mistake. That's not what it says. And I realized this because when I went to Japan, I asked them, is this what it says? And they just looked at each other and went, no, that's not what it says. I said, but that's what it says in English. Didn't anyone check it? And the actual translation to the just laws of nature are actually fair way of heaven on earth. The point I'm making here is that there is an assumption that religion or tradition was not important to the Japanese. It was. Okay, Confucianism was important for the Chinese. and Islam was important to the Malaysians and the Afghans. So what I'm explaining to you here is this is a moment where religion and tradition is still important in the way that they are being informed of modernizing their lawmaking. It's still important. And you can't see this, unfortunately, in terms of the PowerPoint. I can see it here. So in the Ottoman Constitution, in Article 5, it says, His Majesty the Sultan is irresponsible and sacred. Article 7 says, sacred prerogatives of the Sultan. Article 2 says, Istanbul is the capital of the Ottoman Empire, making the case that Istanbul will be the capital of the Ottoman Empire until the end of time. The idea of creating a constitution is to let not only your local citizens know, but everybody else know that this constitution means we're going to be here. This is our sovereignty. This is a law. You can't challenge this. We're going to be here until the end of time. And the Ottomans believed that. All right. The Meiji Constitution, Article 3. The emperor is sacred and inviolable. This is the same article. Let's look at Qing China, Article 1. The great Qing emperor rules the great Qing empire for all generations and must be eternally respected. Article 2, the sacred dignity of His Majesty may not be violated. What you're seeing consistently in this Asiatic constitution is the idea of the sacredness of the one who's in power. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, is the Sultan as Khalifa. In the case of the Meiji, it's the Meiji ruler, the emperor, who is the connection between heaven and human society, and a similar component in China. Actually, in China, it was a lot more controversial because you have the contestation between the Manchu and the Han and so forth, right? In that sense. So what you see then, which is really intriguing, is that these Asiatic empires in their traditions have a way of seeing the ruler in a particular religious form. We do have something similar like that in Christian constitutions, but they don't resonate in regards to authority in the same way that the Asian constitutions do. Now, what the point I'm making is, why could there be an Ottoman influence? Because the Ottoman constitution came first. It came before all of these constitutions. And these practitioners were coming to Istanbul. And they wanted to see the constitution. So I'll give you an example. Wait a minute. Okay, an example is in China, they have their constitution in 1909. Okay, now what's interesting about China's constitution in 1909 is they start to write that the Ottomans have a constitution. Even the Ottomans have a constitution now. They brought it back. We are the only Asian society that does not have a constitution. We have fallen behind all the other Asian societies, including the Ottomans. I remember reading that they said, we and the Ottomans are both sick. They are the sick man of Europe, we are the sick man of Asia, and we are both addicted to drugs. They are addicted to coffee, and we are addicted to opium. They're just laughing, like how they're trying to create this commonality. And what was intriguing is, putting this anecdote aside, they actually printed the Ottoman constitution in their newspapers before they introduced their own constitution. Not only the Ottoman constitution, but the Iranian constitution. Both of them. They put it in their newspapers, and 1 month later, you have a constitution. How does that happen? Right? I think it's Yang Jiwei, I can't say his name, but there's a Chinese delegate who comes to Istanbul during the Young Turk Revolution. He's here. And he sees the revolution, and he sees that the Ottomans have brought the constitution, and he's convincing his counterparts in China to have a constitution. Okay? So what I'm telling you here is interesting. Is in the case of Johor Bahru, a delegation comes to Istanbul, and 2 years later, you have a constitution, and you have the Majelle. In the case of Japan, a delegation comes to Istanbul, and 1 year later, you have a constitution in Japan. In the case of China, the Ottomans have a revolution, and 6 months later, you have a constitution in China. Okay, in the case of Iran, which is interesting, Iran is a response to what happens with the Japanese defeating the Russians. As the Japanese defeat the Russians, The Russians have a revolution, they have a constitution. The Iranians have a revolution, have a constitution. And the Ottomans have a revolution and have a constitution. The Iranian constitution is lost. And I was speaking to an Iranian who said, but the Iranians had it before the Ottomans. I said, no, the Ottomans had it in 76. And this is interesting in the Iranian case. The majority of the Iranian ideas on constitutional discourse are from Iranian thinkers who lived in the Ottoman Empire, not in Iran, the majority. That's not to say they weren't in Iran, they were, especially the ulama in Iraq, in Najaf in particular. So Muhammad Hussein Naini in particular, and he's not the only one, Khorasani and Shirazi, these are all constitutionalists. They're living in Iran and they're reading Ottoman works. And there are Iranian liberal thinkers who are living in Istanbul are also writing about this. So you can see that when I'm talking about moving scholars, in the Iranian case, there are scholars coming to Istanbul and living in Iran. In the Afghan case, there are Ottoman scholars who are sent to Afghanistan. In the Malaysian case, the Malaysian delegates have come to Cairo and to Istanbul. In the case of the Japanese, they have come to Iran and they have come to Istanbul on 3 occasions. In the case of the Chinese, they have come to Istanbul and they are printing the Ottoman constitution. I don't know what language they were reading, to be honest with you. I'm assuming it was the French version, not the Ottoman Turkish. So the point I'm making here, or just to wrap up, it's like, I've got a minute. The point I'm trying to make with this work that I'm working on is I'm trying to show that the Ottomans, if we were to center the Ottomans in this narrative, that even though there's no denying an influence and a sort of intervening of Western European thought regarding legal transformation in Asiatic societies. But what I'm trying to understand is how did they see the Ottoman Empire? Did they see the Ottoman Empire as an alternative? Did they see the Ottoman Empire as Asian? Did they see them as Islamic? Did they see them as European? How did they view the Ottoman Empire? Because why did they start to take the Ottoman Empire interesting? And if they started to take the Ottoman Empire interesting, then there's 2 things that I then want to see. How did Muslims see the Ottoman codification and modernization process? In this case, we're looking at Iran, Afghanistan, and Malaysia. And how did the non-Muslim states like China, Siam, because Siam is another state that I didn't mention in this paper, and China and Japan see the Ottoman Empire modernization process? How did that happen? What's going on here, right? And in that sense, if we start to write a history as the Asian world has been far more interconnected, then that's just sign to tell me to stop. Then we can maybe understand the Ottoman project a bit better, because a lot of the Ottoman project is very Istanbul-centered, and it hasn't viewed that Istanbul had the capacity to influence the rest of the world as an alternative power, okay, in that sense. And so when we see the concept of European colonial powers, Istanbul is different. It's not a colonial power, but it is a modern power. It is a Muslim power, but it is European. It is Asian at the same time. It's all of these things. And as a result, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we don't see this type of Muslim lawmaking which has the capacity to influence other states. We don't see that happening. So you don't see a Majelle equivalent anymore. The idea that the Majelle is created in Istanbul and other states are looking at it. That sort of practice doesn't happen in the Muslim world anymore. And so for that reason, while this whole project at the moment is at its tentative stage, I'm quite optimistic that there is something here in that sense. So yeah. So I will now stop. Thank you very much for being patient with me and listening to this. I really appreciate it, because I haven't formulated all of my thoughts and ideas, and I was very sick, so I couldn't really put my PowerPoints together for you. So I'm really sorry about that. I really want to apologize for that. But thank you very much, and I will leave now it open for the Q&A. Thank you. So if anyone has a question, just put your hand up. It's fine. I'm moderating myself. This is amazing. I have all the